realize I haven't done a wrap-up video in quite some time. The last one I did was in January, so I'm just going to pick up with February through right now. The first book I finished in February was Shoggoth's Old Peculiar, which is a short story by Neil Gaiman that I listened to on audio because I think it was free one day on Audible even if you're not a regular subscriber. It was a really interesting read, and it had a lot of references that I didn't really get, but it was still enjoyable. I rated it 4 stars. The next book I read was Legend by Marie Lu. It was the first time I've read this book, and I know it was really popular, but I only gave it 3 stars. It was an interesting enough storyline, and it was, you know, somewhat diverse, and the main character was a pretty cool girl. But in the end, it just felt like a typical YA book, and the writing was alright, but not really my favorite kind. So I don't think I'll be continuing on with that series. The next book that I read was Volume 3 of Lumberjanes. I actually happened to be browsing in a comic book store, which I don't often do, and I saw this, not realizing that it was released in comic book stores earlier than it was in other stores, so I bought it and I read it straight away, and of course I really enjoyed it. I gave it 5 out of 5 stars. The next book was the Guernsey Literary and Potato Peel Pie Society, which I think is the longest title of a book that I own, but I really enjoyed this book and I lent it to my mom right after and she also really liked it. The writing is just really great. It's an epistolary novel, so you get to read letters by all sorts of different people while this story is being crafted, and it just has a really sweet ending. I rated it 5 stars. The next book I read was Kindred by Octavia Butler. I read this on ebook and I really enjoyed it. I think it's one of Octavia Butler's most well-known works, and for good reason. I rated it 5 stars, and I'm sure I will read more of her work in the future. The next book I read was My Life on the Road by Gloria Steinem. If you don't know, this was the first book in Emma Watson's book club that is based on Goodreads, and I was a little behind in reading this in time in the same month that it was assigned, but I still really enjoyed it. I thought it was really well done, and it was really, I guess, intersectional, including large sections about Black women and Native American women and lesbian women. It didn't really include anything about transgender women, but other than that, it was a pretty good read, and I rated it 5 stars. Next, I read Adulthood is a Myth by Sarah Anderson. I've been following her on Tumblr for a long time. You might recognize her style here, but just really hilarious illustrations and comics that you can relate to and that I know I relate to, about kind of just being a hermit and adjusting to adulthood, and I really recommend checking this out. I gave it 5 stars. Next, I read P.S. I Love You. I finished it in the middle of March, even though I meant to read it as a Valentine's Day book. I just didn't quite get to it in time, and I really enjoyed it, though having seen the movie first and seen the movie several times before I ever read the book, I kind of have to say that the movie is better. There is actually quite a lot that is different in the book, and I ended up giving it 4 stars. It was still a really cute read, but I kind of just liked the way things happened in the movie a bit better. Next, I read Career of Evil by Robert Galbraith, aka J.K. Rowling, and I really enjoyed this. I really enjoyed all of her more recent adult works, and this one was very gripping, even though parts of it were very disturbing. If you are into thrillers and mysteries and just kind of procedural crime stories, I think you would really like this. Next, I read The Epic Adventures of Lydia Bennet. I used to own this, but actually already gave it away because I didn't really enjoy it that much. I gave it 3 stars. I just kind of felt like it wasn't very epic. The first part is just kind of her lazing around and going to school and going to therapy, and the adventures don't really start until the very last part of the book. And I was kind of hoping for a bit more and was expecting the plot to go beyond, like what would have happened after the book ended. I wanted that story, and this one was kind of more like the transition between the Lizzie Bennet Diaries and the epicness to follow. The next book I read is just kind of weird. It's the story of Little Black Sambo. And I ended up with this book because my aunt, I think I remember correctly, gave me this because she found it in some antique shop and she knows I like old books. So I read it and then I think I donated it to a thrift store. It was just kind of an interesting little story and I ended up not really rating it anything. It was originally published in 1899 and the illustrations were just not very high quality, so yeah. The next book, however, I absolutely loved, and that is The Secret Garden by Frances Hodgson Burnett, illustrated by Inga Moore. And oh my gosh, this was the second time I've read this book, but the first time in this physical copy, and it is seriously one of the most beautiful books I have ever read. There's so many beautiful illustrations, and before getting this book I did a lot of research to see which edition I wanted and which illustrations. And I really feel like these illustrations capture the mood that I get from reading the book and the mood that I remember from watching the movie as a kid. And the first time I read this, I think I gave it 3 or 4 stars. I felt like some of the language was kind of cheesy and weird and the illustrations were not that great, but reading this copy in the middle of spring as the trees were blooming and the birds were chirping right outside my window, I just had a fantastic experience. And this is seriously one of my new all-time favorite books. So yeah, I definitely recommend this. And if you watched my last video, you know that I have read The Life-Changing Magic of Tidying Up by Marie Kondo. This is a very well-known book these days, and I went through the whole process and got rid of a lot of stuff, and I mentioned in my last video I didn't really get rid of a whole lot of books, but it was definitely an interesting read and it was beneficial in the end. Next I read Fight Club, and this book was one of the very first books I ever added to Goodreads years ago. So I'm proud to say that I have finally read it, and I had watched the movie before I read it, so I knew how it was going to end, and I did find that the movie followed the book pretty darn closely, and I ended up rating it 4 stars. The next book is one that I had been reading for quite a while, and that is The Name of the Rose by Umberto Eco. It took me a long time to get through because while part of it was very exciting and interesting, a lot of it was very slow, very detailed, and so many people would go on these like monologues or just describe a scene for a very long time and list lots of things that they are seeing, and it took forever to get through. I ended up rating it 3 stars because I did really enjoy the actual plot and mystery that is in the book. But if you don't like a slow-moving book, I wouldn't really recommend this one. After that, I read a very different book, and that is Ready Player One, which was very interesting and exciting the whole way through, and I got through very quickly and enjoyed quite a lot. And this is actually one that kept me thinking about it for a long time afterwards, just kind of wanting to go back into that world and experience more. So I will probably be watching the movie whenever that comes out. I rated it 5 stars. The next book was also an ebook, and that was The Life of Pi by Jan Martel. It's one that I had thought of as a diverse book, only to do a little bit of research and realize that the author, while he has, I think, Spanish or Portuguese heritage, he basically passes as a white Canadian, and I'm finding a lot of the ebooks that I have that I thought were diverse are written by white authors. So I'm going to try to improve that a bit, but also continuing to read those stories because they are at least not about white people themselves. So Life of Pi I did enjoy for the most part. I ended up giving it 3 stars because I found the ending was a little bit slow, although I can see why the information was useful later, and I knew there was a twist and I knew the kind of the basic theme or whatever of what the twist was, but I had it kind of mixed up a little bit, so it was still a surprise and it was interesting. And I haven't seen the movie. Maybe eventually I will. So yeah, that was Life of Pi. Next, I read Unwind by Neil Shusterman, which I also rated 3 stars. I did enjoy it for the most part. I thought it was really interesting. At times I couldn't really tell if it was pro-choice or pro-life or just like purposely complex and whatever. I probably won't be continuing on with this series because I didn't end up caring for the characters that much, but overall I'm glad I read it. Next, I read the final book in the Shakespeare's Star Wars series, or at least final for now because they'll probably do an episode 7 and beyond series, but this is episode 3 because it was released how the original movies were released. And this book was alright. It's, I know, one of the least popular movies of the series, and it kind of comes across in the book. It just wasn't really that interesting. I had never watched the movie all the way through, but at least I've read them all now. I gave it 3 stars. Next, I read the Crochet Stitch Guide, which I got at a craft store that was going out of business and was having a sale, and it was kind of disappointing because it's just a lot of patterns that are very similar to each other, and the instructions are very confusing. And the very first pattern, I'm pretty sure, had an extra instruction row that did not belong there and ended up just creating the project going very wonky. So I didn't end up creating a sample from every single pattern, but I looked through and found ones that I liked, and I might go through just to experience some more different patterns. But overall, not that great of an experience, and I gave it 3 stars. I think for now I'll just stick to finding patterns I like on Pinterest or online and watching YouTube tutorials. The next book that I read was The Miseducation of Cameron Post, and this was an ebook that I've had for a while, and it is one that is LGBTQ. And if you haven't heard of it, it's about this girl who grows up knowing that she is a lesbian, and kind of, it's like it's in the 90s, so when it was a little more, I guess, secretive and hard to know whether people would support you or not, which is definitely still true now from what I've heard. But it was a really interesting read. It was kind of a slow moving plot, but the writing was really great and I was invested in the characters, and overall I really enjoyed it. And I rated it 4 out of 5 stars. And lastly, the most recent book that I have finished is The Library of Souls by Ransom Riggs. And this is the 3rd and final book in the series of Miss Peregrine's Home for Peculiar Children. And though I really liked the first 2, this one I did not like so much. I felt like the beginning felt like the end, and then the middle was this huge just like info dump and very slow, and then the end again was more adventurous and it felt like an end, and you know, the ending was fine. I enjoyed it, but overall I gave it 3 stars. I often found that I wasn't really drawn to it and I put off reading it until I realized if I finish this, then I can make the next book that I read the next book in the Outlander series, which I know I love. So I pretty much read 75% of it on my day off, which was the 4th of July. So those are all the books that I have read February through basically the beginning of July. I have been reading a lot of books pretty decently, even though I'm now working 2 jobs, basically more than full time. Thank you, by the way, to those of you who have wished me luck on my new job. I've now been in my new job for 3 weeks, so I've gone through a lot of training, and while sometimes it was kind of stressful being the perfectionist that I am and not always having the answer or knowing what I am supposed to do in order to accomplish something, but I'm really getting the hang of things now and enjoying it and just settling into the routine of things. And yeah, I really enjoy it, and I'm glad that I'm making this change, and life in general is pretty good. So, as always, thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video, and let me know if you enjoyed any of these books or want to know more about them. Just chat in the comments below. So, I will see you next time. Bye-bye.